Scott Jones joins us from Outback Treatment to talk about getting started as a volunteer in the recovery industry. He is focused on trauma and attachment issues with his clients and in his own life. He talks about current buzzwords like regulation and dysregulation and his experience with brain spotting and experiential based therapies. He spends a lot of time with adolescents and talks about the changes in their treatment over his career. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery, ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Today, Kurt and I have the joy and privilege of talking with Scott Jones. Scott is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. He's a relationship expert, therapist, innovative problem solver, and public speaker. Scott has worked with adolescents for much of his career. He is a 6'6" tall role model that most kids respect and appreciate his presence. He is currently working with an Outback therapeutic program, which is a wilderness experiential program approach. He's used brain spotting in his work and is fascinated by the powerful brains that we all have. Scott, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's kind of fun. You do some things that I think about. I'm not trained as a brain spotter, but I know I've done the EMDR training, and it seems like brain spotting kind of came off of that and is a spin-off of that, and there's several others. So it'd be interesting to talk about that a little bit as we get going. But maybe to start, give our listeners a little bit of an idea of how you ended up in the counseling world.
Yeah. You know, I used to think that I just kind of accidentally ended up here, but I think the older I get, the more I see the path, and that it was probably always meant for me. I started as a volunteer. Really, I got my degree. I bounced around as a college student trying to figure out what I was wanting to do, but I was always drawn. I thought I'd be a teacher, actually. I thought maybe a teacher or something to do with helping people was always something I wanted to do, was drawn to. I ended up getting my undergrad in psychology, and I volunteered. I had a good friend that was working in an adolescent residential program as their director. And he just one day says, "You should come and check it out." And so I did. I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by, the students that were there and what was going on. And so I volunteered. I ended up getting hired on as a kind of a frontline staff, working kind of in the trenches with them, and eventually worked my way kind of through the whole organization. And I was with that organization for a couple decades, almost, actually. Took a little break and went and worked for a program that was starting some adolescent treatment programs in Georgia. But then ended up back. That program's called Stillwater Academy here in Salt Lake. But ended up continuing on, getting my degree, becoming a licensed therapist, and I was a therapist there, director there for many years. So I don't know. I kind of stumbled upon the industry, but once I was there, I felt like home. that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any history, background, trauma, substance abuse, anything in your background that would have lent to you coming this direction? Because so many therapists have their own stories, and that's kind of what gets them in that direction. You sound like you started working in the industry and said, "Hey, this is what I want to do."
Yeah, I think my answer would have been different 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago I would have said, no, I don't think I really have any story like that. I was just interested. But, the more I learn about trauma, I think we can probably all answer yes to that question in some degree. But my story, I think did have an effect on it. I'm the oldest. My mother and father, I was their first child. And my mother was diagnosed with cancer right as I was born. And I actually still don't know a lot about how sick she was and what that was like. So I only make some assumptions, right? But what I assume is that was a very stressful time for her and my family and everybody. And what we know about those little T traumas now is that's going to have an effect on a little guy, right? But she passed away when I was about 18 months old. And my father, being a young father, he was in the Army Reserve, working, school, all that. It was a lot to handle. So I actually ended up living with my grandparents. And I imagine my grandparents probably took a major role even from day one because my mother was sick. And I think that's had an effect, right? My grandparents were just gems. It's very interesting. I'm at the stage of life now where I have my own grandchildren. And I think I'm about the age, maybe a little bit younger than they were when they took me on. But I can't even imagine at my age taking on a newborn again, just gems, my grandparents. And I feel like so much of who I am and, anything that's good, I attribute to them. But I lived with them until I was about 5 when my father remarried. And then I went and lived with him and my stepmom, who I call mom. But I think that was at 5, that was a pretty big upheaval too, right? I'm with these people who are, in all intents and purposes, my parents. And now I'm with another set of parents. And all of them were fabulous, great people. My mother, my stepmother, who I call my mother, who she is my mother, she's a gem and took on, this child at 5 who I don't know what that was like. I'm sure it wasn't easy. But I think that there's been a piece of me that really relates to those attachment issues that so many of the kids we work with have. Because I think I had some disrupted attachment, My father and I were never very close. And even as I became an adult, we weren't super close. I always respected him, and he was a great father. But I think that bond was never really established early on, And I think I've worked through my own issues with that. My father actually passed away from cancer too, several years ago, and when he passed away, that's when I started, I think, doing my work. Isn't how that always happens. Now that they're gone, you can't really repair the relationship. Now you better get busy working on yourself. So I think that's had something to do with it. I'm very much drawn to trauma work and trying to understand and create a space for people to work through their own kind of disrupted attachment issues or trauma issues that they have.
Do you think that time of death, is that, like, does it awaken all of those feelings, or is there a certain element where, like, in some ways now it's safer to take on?
That's a great question, Kurt. It's probably both, right? It definitely awakened some of those feelings, for sure. But I think it was also safer. I never wanted to disappoint him. I never wanted to hurt his feelings. And doing some of that work with him may have, And so yeah. I think that's a great question. I continued to be, my grandparents are gone now too, but Gosh, they always were very important in my life too. My wife and I joke. I had to get their approval of my wife when we were dating long before I got my parents. My parents were just going to have to live with it, but my grandparents, I wanted them to give their stamp of approval, which I think says a lot about the relationship.
Well, and it's interesting, your story is, as you talk about it, you said, you had to dive in and do your work, which maybe you'll agree with me on this, that to really be a good therapist, you got to do your own work as well as, you got to do your own work and be able to identify your triggers and your transferences and all of those dynamics that go into doing counseling and really being a good counselor. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's just an ongoing process too, right? We're never done with that.
Right. Well, it's the human process, right? I think,
Sure.
like you said, we all have some sorts of traumas, whether they're big T's or little T's, whether we're aware of them or not aware of them. But that's just part of living, is having those traumas. We all have different stories, and sometimes it's a lot more obvious to people around you that you have those and carry those with you than it might be otherwise, but we all have them. So I agree. I'm curious, as you talked about your mother dying as you're 18 months old, I mean, those kinds of traumas do not sit in our conscious brain, and you're not aware, and it's all pre-verbal stuff. And I imagine as you work with teenagers, and probably brain spotting plays into this, is there's a lot of that pre-verbal, there's no words for it because you didn't have any words at the time these things happened. How do you see those pieces when you're working with your adolescents?
Well, I think one thing that I love about working with adolescents especially is helping, trying to figure out all those puzzle pieces, help them figure it out. I mean, therapy is really about helping a client get from dysregulation to regulation. That's really what it's about. And long-term therapy is only successful to the degree that the client is able to do that on their own, eventually, right? And so I wonder if maybe part of the reason I've been so drawn to adolescent therapy is we focus so much on behavior with adolescents. They're coming to therapy because their behavior's out of control in one way or another. And, you mentioned how much the industry has changed. We've certainly changed the way we look at that and treat that in the last 20 years. And I've been doing it for about 20 years. So I've seen a lot of change, but we're not trying to help kids be obedient or, compliant. That's not the point. The point is helping them uncover what's getting in the way of their success and being able to regulate. So yeah, brain spotting, mind-body based therapies have always been very fascinating to me, because I feel like we're carrying these things around that we don't even know. Like you say, they're nonverbal. And so how do we get to those? And traditional talk therapy, while I do a lot of it all the time, it sure takes a long time to get to those levels of the brain that are going to make any difference, right? So whatever we can do. So that's also why I've always been very interested in experiential based models of therapy. Early on, I was fascinated by things like taking the kids to the ropes course and putting people through safe experiences that take them way out of their comfort zone. And I didn't realize that, I don't think, 20 years ago. I didn't know why it was working, but why it works is because it gives us a safe place to explore those unconscious places. Is what I believe.
That's fascinating. Talk a little bit about the experiential, type of work that you do, and how you see that affecting adolescents. Well, and maybe I'll even take a step back and ask the question: adolescents are a very interesting population to work with. They're different on some levels than adults or people who are sometimes ready to do their work, right? Come into therapy because they're ready to do their work, and these teens are being told that they have to go to treatment and they don't always want to be there. How do you see those relationships building in that dynamic, and what's your approach? Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I was thinking about this. I was talking about this with a colleague the other day, and the fact that most of the adolescents I work with are not choosing; they're resistant to that. But I've also never met a client that was really not resistant. I think we're all resistant, right, in one way or another. But it is at a different level with most of the adolescents we work with. So I think my approach. Gosh, it has a lot of legs, right? The first, I think I really operate from a place of they would if they could. We all would if we could. Kind of the Ross Green approach of we would choose to be happy, right? Why would we choose anything different? And so if there's behaviors, if there's things that are getting in the way of that, then part of therapy has to be figuring out why that is, what's going on, right? But operating, especially with adolescents, from a place of if they could do it different, they'd do it different. They're not just choosing to be jerks, right? They didn't wake up in the morning and say, how can I terrorize my parents today? How can I get kicked out of English class today? So those are all adaptive behaviors. And so I really look at the behaviors that my clients come into treatment with as they're adaptive. That they're not they end up being maladaptive in other environments, but in the environment that they're created, they're very adaptive. So I think we really have to come from a strength-based approach. So we're, instead of focusing on what's going wrong, let's focus on what's right. Let's start there. Let's help them be seen and heard and feel like they matter. It's a catchphrase that's been used way too much in our industry, but we take a relationship approach. Well, of course we do, but what does that really mean, right? And how do you chart that? What does that look like? And I think that really it's about not having a non-judgmental. I can't come in with any of my own biases, which is really hard. That's why as therapists we have to keep doing our work, because I'm always trying to challenge my own set of biases and lenses I look through, because the kids will pick up on that so fast. And then I think the thing I like the most about therapy is just trying to figure out the system, right? It's interesting to me that most kids do really well in treatment. When they come to treatment programs, they do really well, and then they get out of treatment and they don't do very well. A lot, not all the time, but a lot of times, right? And they go back into old behaviors. And why is that? And I think they get to a place in treatment where in a program where they're feeling safe, they're feeling heard, they're starting to examine their own hurts and traumas and things that are there. They're being educated about all these things. They're learning self-regulation skills in an environment that contributes to that. And then we kind of throw them back into the environments that caused all the adaptive behaviors in the first place, right? So we have to take it all as a system, look at all the moving pieces. And I love that part about therapy. And I think all of that leads to you create a relationship of trust. You have a place where they can feel seen and heard, and their strengths are being highlighted rather than everything that's wrong with them. You come from a place of, instead of what's wrong with you, to what happened to you, and then you can do things like maybe brain spotting or EMDR, where you can get to those underneath limbic, very base level things, and help and their brains, their bodies know how to make things better. Mm-hmm. You just help them access that.
Yeah.
So I see myself as you're kind of the cruise director of all those moving parts, just trying to get them to figure it out themselves. I'm not the healer. I'm definitely not the guy with all the answers. but I do care, and I want to create a space that they can figure it out.
Well, and these kids are smart, right? They're smart kids, and they come with a whole bunch of really, great ideas and thoughts, and capacity to do some of their own work when they're given the right information. because this
Yeah.
is new stuff to them, and they've been in sometimes situations where they're not heard and seen and understood, and that's frustrating. So
Yeah.
I love that approach, and I think kids are incredible, and when they can engage in therapy, and then the kind of tools that you provide them in treatment and self-regulation, that it really gives them a head start to their adult life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I see so many kids I've worked with, they get out of treatment and then they start leading their own groups. They start helping others, and the adults around them are blown away because in many ways they're further down the trail than most of the adults that are around in some ways.
Well, that's a challenge that I think that we have in our industry or in our communities now, is how do we allow, adolescents, teenagers, young adults to take those leadership roles that they really are capable of taking, and help them move into that, and support them in that. I think that's something that maybe we're taking some of that away from them, or have been in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another thing that really influences my work is just the ideas of, resiliency and grit. Those are two very common catchphrases as well. But, the work that Carol Dweck did and that Lee Duckworth, I look at both of those concepts between kind of a growth mindset and what does grit look like. And, the kids that I work with today are so different than the kids I worked with 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago it was kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and parents are concerned, and let's get them on the right path. And it was pretty simple in lots of ways. And now, man, it's so complex. The adolescents we work with now are so complex, and there's so many things going on. And I think helping them get some of these things figured out before they're adults is just critical to their long-term success. It's not just about, oh, my son's using pot. I mean, it's a lot deeper than that, right? And so helping not only the kids I work with, but the families I work with understand that is really, really important.
What's the real shift there? Because like the internal kind of dialogue, the internal issues probably couldn't have changed that much. Is it the means and access to information, and for teens in those relationships? Is it are parents more understanding? They just understand, there's an emotional intelligence that's a little bit greater now than there was 20 years ago. What's the real difference between?
I think if we had the answer to that, it would be a really good book. We should write it together because I think we'd make a lot of money. I think it's really complex, right? I think technology and the access to information is definitely part of that. Absolutely. I think just in general, at least, here in the, Western world that we're a part of, the general affluence that we have gives us access to a lot of things. And I think there's just a lot of stuff. But I think, parents especially, I think it's generational, right? I think it's generational. When I think about my parents, it was about putting food on the table. It was about getting by, and teaching basic principles, right? And then, gosh, my kids, I have 3 kids, and it was all about, are they in the right classes? Are they in the right sports teams? My daughter, when she was 8 years old, said, I'm going to play volleyball for Stanford. That's crazy, right? And that got, my wife and I's gears. Okay, well, great. We got to get her in the right volleyball clubs. And, from the age of 8, that's a lot of stress. It's a lot of stress. And when you look at just the academics, it used to be, let's learn our ABCs in kindergarten. Now, it's way beyond that. So I think it's a lot of things. I think it's generational. I think as parents, we want our kids to be happy. So that sometimes translates into let's help them avoid being unhappy. at all costs. And so our kids don't learn how to deal with that. We want our kids to be successful, so that translates into, it's no longer helicopter parents. It's let's bulldoze the path and line it with flowers and roses and make it, because it's coming from a good desire. But I think a lot of times we end up passing on to our kids these kind of patterns and traits that then end up, as kids, the kids I'm working with, for the most part, are anxious. Their limbic systems, I think, are on high alert constantly. And then, oh, by the way, throw a little pandemic in the mix. That's going to help, right? So I just think it's really complex. And I think the answer in the end is getting back to basics. How do we regulate? How do we regulate our emotional states so that we can deal with all of the things life throws at us? And that's got to start with going back to when we become dysregulated. I think for many of us, that started, pre-verbal. That started a long, long time ago. So creating a place where we can access that and start working on that is super important.
Well, and it's interesting as you work with these kids and go back to the basics, right? You're teaching them those very basics of emotional regulation and understanding how our bodies and brains work, and obviously taking away the shame and the stigmatism of something's wrong with you, and if you'll just fix my child, our family will be all better, and try to work through some of those pieces. It's not necessarily that you're saying you can't go achieve all of these things that you really want to achieve, but you've got to be able to do the basics first, and then let's figure out what's really important to you and not just what's being put on you, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, shame, right? I mean, that's at the heart of so much of this. And we have it as parents. I tell a lot of stories. I'm a storyteller. I think stories connect us and help us, and we can learn in different ways. But so can I share a story?
Yeah, I was just gonna say you better share a story with us of what you share with them.
Stories that come to mind. I have 3 kids. One of my sons, when he was, I think it was middle school-ish age, gosh, he and I would battle over academics, over homework, we would just battle, and I felt bad about it. I was starting to wonder, well, maybe there's things going on, maybe there's things I don't know that are going on. Maybe he's got some learning differences or something. And so I was worried about him going into high school and just really struggling. We took him to get tested, had a full neuropsychological done by a very prominent psychologist here in Salt Lake Valley, and who I had a relationship with and stuff. And as I look back now, I'm like, gosh, my poor son spent a whole Saturday getting tested. He was just so easygoing about it. Anyway, my wife and I go in a week later to get the results, and this good friend of mine, he looks at us and said, well, the good news is you're super involved. You want to help. You're looking at different options. I'm really glad about that. You're in the industry. You understand. Probably the bad news is for you, nothing wrong with your son. This is all you. There's no learning disabilities there. There's no ADHD. There's nothing that's really getting in the way academically. So let's look at, what your systems are doing to your kid. Because we were creating a lot of anxiety, right? And we were creating a lot of, and the conflict wasn't good. So that was a good gut check for me. But, the interesting thing looking back is, I changed one thing, and that was I just made a commitment that I was not going to bring up homework. We were not going to have a school-related conversation unless we connected in some other way, right? Unless we'd had some other sort of connection. And if that meant I went several days and it just wasn't an opportunity to make a good connection, that means I couldn't bring up school, even if I knew he was behind on his homework, right? And it changed. It changed everything. It changed the relationship. He did just fine. He's going to be an accountant. He's got his last quarter of school, Anyway, and obviously everybody's story is different. They don't always turn out that good. But the point for me was was my concern about him and his homework habits and school habits, was that about him or was it about me? It was really about me. You know, it's about my own shame. What if I have a son that doesn't do well in school? What does that say about me as a father? And all this nonsense about how somehow that had something to do with me. It didn't have anything to do with me. You know, what he did, his strengths, his greatness, that's all him. And so being able to work on that, let go of that myself, and just focus again on the relationship, it makes all the difference. And in one way or another, I think that's the answer in every case. You know, how do we let go of our own shame and get rid of, you know, those things that hold us back? I got one more story. Can I share one more story?
Oh, yeah.
But I think before you move on from that, I think
Yeah.
that, you know, he's in a good position now, and so you kind of joke that, oh, it all worked out. You're
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, you shouldn't have been worried in the first place, right? But the reality is that, like, if you hadn't gone and gotten that scan, right? If you hadn't put your family in a position for that friend to be able to say, you're broken, not him, you might have just started pushing harder, right? And it could be a
True,
different
so
result,
true. Yeah,
right?
so true.
It's not that asking for help was the difference, right? That was the right parenting decision,
Yeah.
regardless of the fact that it
Thank
wasn't
you.
the answer you expected, right?
Right. And also if the answer would have been, yeah, look, there's some executive functioning stuff going on. There's some ADHD. There's some, even if that was the answer, it doesn't change my part of it too, right? Still, the
Yeah.
answer for me would have been, let go of my own shame and just be his dad. You know, it's either way, that would have been the answer. But yeah, you're right. Getting help, I don't want to minimize that for sure.
Well, and it also makes me think of, I was reading Stephen R. Covey's, I don't know, maybe it was Seven Habits, one of his books, and he was telling a story about him and his wife and his children. And he had all of these really high achiever children that were thriving and doing well, and he had one child that just was really struggling. And they were doing all these things to help this child get over their struggles and to be able to do the same as everybody else. And as he talked about this and got counsel around how he was doing this, what he realized and what he was shown is that he was actually sending a message to his child that his child wasn't capable and they were going to help him, and that the child wasn't capable. And in all of our best efforts as parents, that's not the message we intend to send, but often is. And when you just shift that, I love how simple, Scott, that you said your job was simply to learn to connect with him on anything else and in a different way before you even talked about something that might create, anxiety or whatever with schoolwork. Such a simple thing, but then you're listening and you're connecting, and then we can start to shift some of that. And the message that they learned to send was that you're capable and we trust you and we're here to help. Let us know how we can help, but go and do your stuff, and we're your cheerleaders, and here we go. And it was an interesting shift because, I could see myself how I had done that with my own children and went, oh, I don't think any of us recognize when we're doing that. And that was just a huge learning experience for me, that I appreciated that perspective.
Yeah. So interesting. And when I think about the parents, the families I work with too, by the time a student comes to wilderness therapy, there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of craziness going on. Parents don't take a decision like that lightly. That's maybe the hardest decision they've ever made. But helping, so taking the focus from, if my child kind of has a storm going on, whatever that storm looks like, so that could be drugs, that could be suicidal behavior, that could be self-harming, that could be falling out of school, and it could be a million different things, right? But there's this storm going on. As a parent, it's so easy to react to that storm as if that storm is directed at me, right? And if I look at it in that way, that's definitely going to influence the way I respond. If it's about me, then maybe I have to help them understand something. I got to teach them a lesson. I gotta hold the line. Something. right? It's going to have those type of responses. Or also, if it's about me, maybe that brings up my own storm, all the stuff inside of me, and so I got to shut it down. I got to control this, right? But if we can recognize that the storm's happening, inside of them, that they're having a storm, it's not about me. That really opens up a bunch of different options, right? How can I now be supportive? How can I help? How can I be aware of my own storms and make sure they don't combine and become a hurricane that we're all in together, So I think that's just critical, and in the family systems work we do to help parents see the difference between helping because I'm trying to protect myself, or helping because that's what I want to do. I'm helping them become their best selves,
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm anxious to hear your second story.
Okay. Maybe it's related, maybe it's not. It's something I think about a lot. But I had an opportunity several years ago to take a bunch of boys on a hiking trip into the Wind Rivers of Wyoming. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it is beautiful. It's a multi-day backpacking type experience, right? So we were taking these young Boy Scouts. We were taking them up in there. We prepared all summer by going on little hikes. We did lots of work about how to pack. We're using all freeze-dried food, right? You're packing several days, so it's all about being efficient, being fit, all those things. So finally, the big day arrives, and our first day of hiking. And I'd never been up there myself either. We had somebody else who was very experienced in the area, but I'd never been there. So I had anxiety about it. I was excited. We started on this path, and the path is literally paved for like the first mile. And I was thinking to myself, what is the big deal? This is easy, right? But then eventually you turn off the pavement, and it starts to go up, gets a lot harder. And then you take another turn, and then it starts to get really steep and pretty challenging. And that first day, it started to rain. So we stopped, and everybody that had remembered their rain gear put their rain gear on. And then it started to sleet and hail. Then the sun would come out. Then it would start to rain. Then the sun, and it just, it was crazy, right? And it was an experience that first day. But there was one young man that maybe a mile or so into it, he asked us to stop and take a break. And then another half a mile, we took a break. And then another quarter mile, we took a break. And I was starting to think, he's not going to make it. I don't think he's going to make it. What are we going to do? We're going to have to carry him back. So we had lots of stops. But anyway, eventually we made it to the first camp area where we needed to be. And it had been quite a trying day. The sun would come out and these boys would just yip and holler, and they were so excited to dry out, and then we'd get sleeted on again. And it was a cool experience. But we get to the camp, and all the boys are setting up their individual little camp areas. And I was checking on everybody, and I came up to this boy who had to stop several times. And he was small. He's not a huge guy. And he's taking stuff out of his pack. And as he's taking stuff out, I notice he takes out a Lord of the Rings paperback book, thick book. And then he takes out like a Costco-sized bag of licorice, and a Costco-sized bag of jerky. And all this stuff, of course, we not supposed to bring. And I've just thought about this all the time since that experience several years ago about, well, no wonder he had such a hard time, right? No wonder. He's carrying 20 more pounds than the rest of us. And anyway, so long story short is he made it. The whole hike was great, and he stayed. That first day he wanted to leave, but he stayed, he persevered, and it was a great experience. But as I've thought about that, and it's meant different things to me at different times, but I think, you think about the anxiety, we were putting him in a very uncomfortable experience. And so he brought the things with him that he felt he just had to have. the things that were going to help him regulate. Back to, it's all about dysregulation. He brought those things that he felt were so critical. And in the end, they ended up causing him tons of pain. And you can't, we couldn't control the trail, we couldn't control the weather. There's lots of things we couldn't control. The one thing we could really control is, what were we carrying? What kind of stuff did we bring? And, in his instance, he made his life a lot harder with those things he just felt like he could not do without, right? And as I've thought about that, I mean, isn't that life? Isn't that what we do? That maybe I learned in those first 18 months after my mother passed away, before I even had language, there were some things that I probably carried with me. There's things that I use that I feel like I just can't do without. But in the end, they really cause me problems. They cause me problems in my relationships, in my, my work, in all areas of my life. And I feel like part of what we do in therapy is just help people discover, what's in your backpack. What can you let go of? What do you really need? What do you have to hold on to? And I think that's a beautiful metaphor that I try to keep in mind.
That's fantastic. When I'm assuming you share that with these kids that you work with, and how do they typically respond to something like that? Is it, bells like go off and they're like, oh my heck, we can look at this, or some of them just really don't get what you're talking about?
I think both, right? I probably do share that story more with my kids. I'm sure some of them heard it more than once, but we have great discussions about what's in your backpack. It's one of my favorite groups. We'll do that in a group setting and really unpack what are those things that I'm holding on to. So I think a lot of kids really get it. Parents get it. Eventually we start learning, oh yeah, I'm doing this because of this experience that happened 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe I can let go of that. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's not unique to kids or to adolescents. That's
No.
that's for all of us, right? We're all carrying extra stuff in our backpack. And some of us realize it and just aren't willing to put it down, and other of us don't even have a clue we're carrying it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that story. It's so applicable to real life. I'm curious, as we kind of come to the end of our podcast and our conversation, which I've absolutely loved. I'm curious, Scott, do you just work exclusively for the program, or do you take individual clients?
I have a small outpatient that I do. Yeah, I'm pretty busy with the program, but I do some outpatient clients. Yeah, and I think working with people in recovery, especially with substances and other addictive behaviors, is kind of my jam too. I really like that, and kind of the area I specialize in.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, and I love what you've shared with us today. Super meaningful, and I imagine that as people listen, our listeners are listening, they're going to want to connect with you. What's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Let's see. Well, let me give you probably the best email maybe to get a hold of me is Scott@hingepointcounseling.com.
Excellent. Scott, this has been super valuable. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I love stories. Stories are really what makes my whole life worthwhile. So I love the stories. I appreciate you sharing those. And I think we probably ought to connect later and get some more therapy on our podcast down the road.
That'd be awesome. That'd be great. Thanks so much for having me. This has been fun.
Thanks, Scott.